Question occurs on the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett of Indiana to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. A senator. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Braun. Aye. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. No. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. No. Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Casey. No. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Kramer. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Ms. Ernst. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Gardner. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. No. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. No. Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. King. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mrs. Leffler. Aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. No. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Aye. Ms. Markowski. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Aye. Mr. Perdue. Aye. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Hoven, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Loeffler, McConnell, McSally, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Rosen, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, no. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, no.
Senate will come to order. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The nomination of Amy Coney Barrett of Indiana to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.